So our topic for chapter 11 is thinking about the idea of a multiplier. And I saw some things on that little screen pop up too on searching for possible solutions of the wrongs in society, and what can we do, what should we not do. And so that's a lot of what we're exploring. How much value does it add to create a job for somebody, right? So the government can create a job, go out and dig that hole out there, make sure that it's 40 foot by 60 foot and 3 foot deep. Here's a shovel, and the government just created a job, and so they pay that person $100. And that person goes and runs to the store and buys some stuff, and then the store pays their people, right? And so those people have additional income now that they can go out and spend at a different store. And so the story we told last time was how one form of spending might lead into additional income for society. Now, if the government the next day said, your job today is to go fill that hole in that you dug yesterday. Here's $100. And they go in and fill it in. And then the next day, they come back and they say, dig out that hole back to 3 foot, 40 by 60, put the dirt over there. And so each day, that person's job is to dig out the hole, fill the hole back in. Does that person have income, have a job that they can go spend stuff at Applebee's and Walmart? You betcha, right? So there is something there in the form of income. Is that a good use of society's resources? What's the true cost of doing that? Okay, his time. What else? What's that? There have actually been studies similar to that where it does. In fact, Dave Ramsey goes through an example where a fraction of the people quit coming to work. It was actually a little psychology type of thing where they said dig a hole, fill it back in, and people quit coming to work because the work wasn't meaningful. And they actually kept escalating the pay. They said, we're going to pay you $7 an hour today. Tomorrow it's $14 an hour. The next day was $21 an hour, and people quit coming even though the pay went up. So you're right, there are other things besides the money at stake. But now in this macro class, we kind of want to think about big issues like society's resources. Are we doing the right thing doing that? So what's true about that money of the dig the hole, not dig the hole? We got that person's time. Somebody other than Todd want to jump in on that?
The money has to come from somewhere.
The money has to come from somewhere, that's right. And so there was a great analogy by a guy, I can't remember which politician it was, but I just like the analogy. And he said, the government's solution sometimes to trying to fix the problem that way, it's like going to a swimming pool and taking a bucket of water out of the deep end and bringing it to the shallow end and putting it back in. Right? There's nothing actually changing from economic activity because government dollars have to come from where? What's our two sources we've been talking about? Taxes was one thing, and if they don't have enough taxes, then what does the government do? They borrow it. Right? So that money is literally, that $100 that we're paying you to do that fill the hole, dig the hole thing, there is a cost to it. That money could have been used elsewhere in some other way. And so if it's being borrowed, it's being taken out of the financial system, which is one less company that can go to the financial markets to borrow the money to start a new tech company, right? To start a new company on Main Street, or to fill a new void. Some entrepreneur that has a great idea, that's $100 less maybe that person has at their disposal from the financial markets because the government went and borrowed it. Or on the flip side, if the government does actually have enough money and they're collecting tax, then that $100 is something that could have been used had we not had to raise the tax to have some fill the hole, dig the hole, then that would have been more money left in somebody else's pocket out in the private sector for them to figure out what they wanted to do with the money. In other words, that money's going to get spent. What our hope is that that money will get spent in the best place possible. And so that doesn't always happen when we have it in the hands of government for a variety of solid economic reasons. One of those being is that it's not their money. We're all a lot more careful, aren't we, when we have our own money to spend on how much should we spend, what should be the price, should we negotiate it a little bit heavier, or am I getting the right deal? When it's other people's money, we tend to be a little looser with it, and that creates some inefficiencies. Okay, so those are some of the interesting issues we're tackling. Let me just open up to you. Any questions or comments from what I said? I'd be happy to even take a discussion a different direction if anybody has got something on their mind, interest or a question. We will talk about the multiplier model more. We need to know that too. Okay, that's fine. I'm cool. This was the aggregate expenditure model, AE. And the graph I left you with last time showed this multiplying effect, holding some things constant that we'll elaborate on a little bit more this time. So the spending multiplier in its simplest form was 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. And I'm going to give it to you a little more generically. I gave you the change in G, so you already have that in your notes from last time. By the way, the lecture material Friday, those of you who are gone. So kind of I don't know where it is exactly, but the second half of Friday's time we spent starting chapter 11. So the idea was that if the government has dig a hole, fill a hole, some sort of spending, maybe it's weapons of mass destruction, maybe they're doing something good, they're spending it on education, I don't know what it is, but from the model standpoint, some sort of spending potentially leads to a greater change in income. So as that money travels through where the ditch digger gets their paycheck, runs to Walmart, hits the Walmart cash registers, Walmart pays their employees, they get a paycheck, they take that paycheck, run to Applebee's and have a steak dinner, Applebee's pays its employees, right? So we've got this autonomous injection of spending leading to greater and greater income, potentially. All right, so what was the word autonomous? We had autonomous, and what was the other type of spending we identified? Autonomous and induced. Good. So what was the distinction? That's an important distinction to have for this particular chapter anyway. What was the key to induced expenditure? What's inducing you to spend? Okay, it varies with the real GDP or your income. So you get some money and you spend it, that's induced expenditure. This little thing here, the auto that I put, since we put it in detail last time, that was autonomous spending. And that was spending that does not depend on income. All right, so we're going to work on this a little bit more. This thing here was the multiplier. And I want to, right in the one spot here, kind of put another thing in here, and that is what the real spending multiplier, because you'll see this in your homework problems this week. The more sophisticated multiplier has a bunch more junk in it. And so in your notes last time, we called this the simple multiplier. What was the MPC again? Marginal propensity to consume. Good. So it was the fraction of income that I was going to spend on Walmart stuff. I get my $100 paycheck, I take 90 of it, and I blow it at Walmart, right? My marginal propensity to consume was 0.9, 90%. It's the fraction of your income that's going towards spending. So 1 over 1 minus that number gives us the multiplier. So for instance, if the multiplier, or I'm sorry, if the marginal propensity to consume was indeed 90% or 0.9, what would the multiplier be? What would the multiplier be? You got a calculator, you got 1 over 1 minus 0.9. You'll see some problems like this on your homework. What'd you get? 10, right? So 1 over 1 minus 0.9 is 0.1, 1/10. If you got 1/10 in the denominator, it's a fraction. You flip it over, multiply it times the numerator, and you just get a 10. So the multiplier here is 10. Now that would be a pretty good deal for Obama if he could hire some ditch diggers, pay him $100. How much income would that generate for the economy if the multiplier was indeed 10? 1,000, right? So $100 worth of ditch digging, that guy goes to Walmart, spends it, Walmart pays its employees, those employees run to Applebee's and spend it, right? That $100 worth of spending led to $1,000 worth of income. Pretty good deal, right? If they can spend that kind of money and get it. Now, some things that ignores is what was done to get that money and where the money's going. So if the multiplier is 0.9, then, or I'm sorry, if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, then the multiplier is 10. That means that $100 worth of G, just to kind of get another ditch digging example, that a change of government spending equal to $100 leads to a change of income of $1,000. Assuming, I'll put this in red because we need to be alarmed by what would need to be true to have that happen. And so in order to have that happen, we need the price level to be held fixed. Prices are held fixed. We have a closed economy. Does anybody remember what I meant when I said suppose the economy is a closed economy? It was, again, an assumption of our model. What did that mean? What's that? Just the United States, right? So we're going to pretend that we don't do international trade with anybody, right? We live on our island. We only care about ourselves. So a closed economy. So that's not too realistic. And the importance here is that if I get $100, what if I go buy some Chinese goods with it? Then that kind of leaks out of the system, right? If we're spending that money on foreign goods. So we'd have to have a closed economy in order for that to take place. Okay, so those are big assumptions. Let's look at what the real multiplier looks like. The real multiplier. And this is even a little bit of a stretch. But so first of all, I want to start you off with our cigarettes. If we decompose our cigarettes into its four components of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, good old expenditure approach to measuring income. All right, so what does aggregate expenditures look like? So aggregate expenditures is equal to the consumption function, which, bear with me for a second, I'm going to use this notation here of some number. It's not hashtag. I guess I've got to change that abbreviation probably, but for an old guy like me, this is not hashtag, this is number, because it was the number sign on the old telephone. Yes, I was born after rotary dial, but I had push buttons. So this is, let that be some number. So we got some number, the autonomous part of consumption, plus the marginal propensity to consume, the MPC, times my after-tax income. So write this part down. Don't be too scared yet. Hopefully we'll nurse this thing right along with no problem. I wrote it a little bit differently because I told you this is the real multiplier, and we're going to start to show the complications that we have with kind of taking this simplified approach. And it'll bring in the components that we found out were important in our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So this is disposable income. If I made $1,000 and I faced a 20% tax rate, 1,000 minus 20% times 1,000 is 200 bucks worth of taxes. 1,000 minus 200 bucks worth of taxes is $800 worth of income, right? So this little guy here is just disposable income. And then I'm going to take that money and I'm going to run and spend 90% of it. That's all it is. And then we've got this autonomous part of consumption is the number. All right, so this is the C. This kind of lines up with this. Now, in our notes last time, was investment autonomous or induced? What I gave you, according to our model. It was autonomous. What else was autonomous? So government spending, so this one, let me put a little green marker here with this one. So that was autonomous, government spending was autonomous, exports were autonomous, which just meant that foreigners are going to figure out how much they want to buy from us. So we got check, check, check. If we were doing it like we set up the model, this would be some number, this would be some number, and this would be some number. And then we're just going to add them up, and they'd add up to some number, right? And so with our model we did last time, that was shifting it up in a parallel fashion for the number. So I want to use that notation of plus a number, plus some number, plus some number. So that is the, I'll just put it above it here. This is the I, this is the G, and this is the exports. So now we got C plus I plus G plus X minus a new little guy here, the marginal propensity to import times our income. The MPI. So this is, the MPI is the marginal propensity to import. It was induced. Induced by what? Induced by how much money I have. All right. So this little guy here is our imports. Well, it all actually starts to collapse down pretty fast. The autonomous part, all the autonomous parts end up being some bigger number. So we get aggregate expenditures equal to some number plus the marginal propensity to consume times 1 minus t times y minus the marginal propensity to import times y. So we just simply added up all the numbers. Our aggregate expenditure line is some number times the marginal propensity to consume less a tax effect, which all I did is I sucked out the y out of here, right? Minus the marginal propensity to import. Maneuver and we're done. So we get some number plus the marginal propensity to consume in brackets here times 1 minus t minus the marginal propensity to import times y. All I did is factor out this little guy. Now, as crazy as that looks and as uncomfortable as some of you are, this actually has a pretty simple form. Do you guys recognize it? This is the aggregate expense. This is kind of the sophisticated aggregate expenditure line. It's the slope-intercept form, isn't it? Slope, the intercept, and this is the slope, and this is income. So all we've done is we kind of taken the whole thing and we've collapsed it down into a little more sophisticated view. So this whole thing in brackets here is the slope of the aggregate expenditure. And this little guy here is the intercept. So the real world multiplier is 1 over 1 minus the slope of the aggregate expenditure line, which is this. 1 over 1 minus the slope of the aggregate expenditure line, which is now this little more sophisticated looking thing here. But the guts of the thing kind of makes sense from what the story we were telling, is that my marginal propensity to consume is in here, which is what it was before, all by its lonesome. But in an economy where there's income tax, which I guess I didn't write down on our assumptions here, this was no income tax. There's basically no factor comes into play, and then we allow ourselves to buy from the rest. You'll see some homework problems where we don't really force you to do that. So that's the good news for those of you who are uncomfortable. But you might have to calculate the slope of the aggregate expenditure line, which would just be a rise over run type of deal. So the real multiplier is what I'll write next here. The real multiplier, as real as it can be, or the more sophisticated one, the non-simple one might be a better way. I'm almost hesitant to use the word real, is equal to 1 over 1 minus the slope of aggregate expenditure line. And so in reality, it includes a possible tax and import effect. Does taxes and the potential to import relative to the simple one? There's kind of a lot going on with this one. So if t was 0, this would disappear. So the question is kind of, if I put a positive little t on here, what happens to this little chunk? Does it get bigger or smaller? We got 0.9, and now we've got 1 minus, maybe the tax rate's 20% or something? Does that make this little guy get bigger or smaller relative to when it was 0? When it was 0, it's 1 minus 0, it's equal to itself, right? What do you see is going on here? When this gets bigger, this gets smaller, right? Okay, so that's getting smaller. When this gets bigger, when it was 0, it was nothing, but now that it's something, if we're importing 10% of our goods or 5% of our goods, is that making this whole thing get bigger or smaller? Smaller, because we're subtracting it off. So both of these things are leading to the slope term getting smaller. So with t greater than 0 and the marginal propensity to import greater than 0, the slope of AE, the aggregate expenditure model, the line, the slope of it gets smaller. And makes the multiplier blank. Now we got to come back up to this one. Hopefully we're tracking that this thing's getting smaller. So what's happening to 1 over 1 minus that thing? That one's tough. Got a lot going on. I think it's easier to maybe think if this was 0.9 and now it's 0.8. So it used to be 1 over 1 minus 0.9. The multiplier was 10 through the example we went through. Now, if it's 0.8, this is 1 over 1 minus 0.8 is 0.2, which means the multiplier is 5, which is smaller. Good. So adding more reality to it makes the multiplying effect get smaller. In other words, the politicians don't like it as much because they're not getting as much bang for their buck. If they go hire somebody to do ditches, the $100 worth of spending does not lead to 1,000, it leads to maybe 500, which is still kind of a good deal, but it's not as big of a deal as it was before when we used the very simple one. Okay, questions or comments on that? All right, well, I'm guessing you're sick and tired of those equation goggles, so let's change the boat here a little bit. I want to make sure that this point was brought across here. I kind of wrote it with fancy ways. So the bottom line, is an increase in taxes or an increase in the marginal propensity to import leads to a smaller multiplier. Go leave that up. So next thing we're going to do is tie this back into our aggregate demand, aggregate supply business. What's the connection? So on the top graph, we're going to put the aggregate expenditure line. And on the bottom graph, we're going to put the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model and see how these things are connected. And let's see, I'm going to have to wing it, which is fine. All right, we'll wing it. So upstairs, it's the graph we left off with last Friday, where we're measuring aggregate expenditure and output here. We're going to have two graphs stacked on top of each other, so if you're at the bottom of your page, make sure you leave enough room. The bottom graph, we're going to be measuring real GDP on the horizontal axis and the price level. So this is going to be our goods market. Our aggregate demand, aggregate supply concept is right here. And we're going to show how that relates to the aggregate expenditure model upstairs. So go ahead and draw your 45-degree line. And one way to make these graphs a little bit prettier is to draw it fairly steeply. You don't want to draw it too steep. It never ends up being perfect. If we really graphed it, it would be very steep, but kind of draw your line. They're going to cross there. You can kind of make that fairly steep. Even with our simple multiplier, that makes sense, because if we're consuming 90% of our income, then the slope is closer and closer to 1, which is the slope of the 45-degree line. So this thing shows C plus I plus G plus X, all that stuff we just did is the aggregate expenditures. The two lines cross. What's going on there? What's going on where the two lines cross? It'll be our Y1. It'll be where we'd expect the economy to be, right? So the one interesting thing that it added to our discussion is where inventories fall into play in the economy. And so the kind of the natural invisible hand, if you will, system that we got is that if output drops below this amount, then inventories are going to fall because spending is greater than what those inventories were. And so Walmart's shelves start to deplete. Walmart calls up their supplier and increases production. And if for some reason output swings out beyond where we'd expect it to be, then our inventories are climbing. Walmart calls up, says, I don't need any more, I got plenty on the shelves. Production falls. So this is our justification of why we'd expect us to be at this point. So this, we're going to say, is a long-run equilibrium, which means it corresponds in the bottom graph with our potential level of output. So currently, this level of output is our potential, and it's okay if you want to just draw a YP up there. That's why we stacked them in the first place, is because they're lining up vertically with all the numbers on the horizontal axis. Whatever this number is, if this is 5,000, this is 5,000. So we got everything kind of stacked up nicely vertically. Okay. Go ahead and draw some home base here. Again, it doesn't really matter where you have it for the most part, but we're going to draw a long-run equilibrium, which gives us a price level of some amount. Let's call it 100 just for fun. Keep the numbers easy. And there's our initial situation for the economy. Kind of holding all of the things constant, this is where we'd expect to be. All right, so if the government spends some money, or there's some other autonomous change in spending, what happened upstairs if there was an increase of government spending? What was happening graphically here with the aggregate expenditure line when a new level of autonomous spending changed? It'll shift up, and in what fashion? In other words, did it kind of shift tilted like this or like this? It'll be a parallel shift from that formula we just derived. It's just some number that used to be 100 is now 200 because the government increased autonomous spending. So this intercept here used to be some number, and now it's some number that's higher than that. And so it's going to shift up by the amount of the change. So let's go ahead and shift that up. Let me shift to green. So do a parallel shift up at the new level of government spending. Let's call it G2, and this one was at G1. The thing I left you with last time was that multiplier effect graphically is shown right here because the increase in government spending is this vertical shift up. The effect on income is going to be ultimately this new spot here. Let's call it Y2. And you can see if I took that vertical distance and I made it horizontal, if I just kind of flipped it, these two arrows are the same distance, right? There's your $50 of government spending or whatever, but it has led to $250 worth of income by some multiplier. So that's the graphical representation of the multiplier. All right, questions on that? Please raise your hand if there's something you want me to reiterate or explain again. Okay. What happened down here? What do you think went on? We had an increase in government spending from G1 to G2. What went on down here from chapter 10? Shift aggregate demand, good. Aggregate demand shifted out. All right, so one of our aggregate demand shifters was government spending, and that led this. We had the little ABC thing, or however we want to look at it. Now, this effect is going to be a little different because the multiplier holds the prices fixed. This multiplier up here that's going on holds the prices fixed. So how we're going to model that is if you drop down your Y2 into this space, holding the price level constant, draw a big dot, that's going to be one spot on your aggregate demand curve, your new one. And we'll just draw a parallel shift just for fun. Not real sure what that would be, but your G1 to G2 would look like this. Now, what did Keynes believe was true about wages and resource prices? So we're back to John Maynard Keynes. He was one of our video. Those of you who weren't here, we had kind of an interesting documentary video on Keynes and Hayek. What did he say about price adjustments, and more specifically wages? There's kind of a catchy word that he used for wages that you should remember. They're sticky. Good. So sticky wages, which means that wages tend to remain pretty rigid. That might be due to long-term contracts. That was brought up in the video, that there might be contracts between employer and employee, and so those tend not to change. There might be cultural aspects of our job that wages don't tend to be too volatile. They'll stay pretty fixed. Maybe they'll ratchet up, but they don't tend to ratchet down, right? Because we don't want to hurt our employees' morale maybe or something. So a number of different reasons. Remember sticky wages. With Keynes' theory, that's one of the things he hangs his hat on, because Keynes's demand curve, or I'm sorry, Keynes's supply curve would actually look like this. There's sticky prices, sticky wages. So if I take this short run aggregate supply curve and I Keynesify it, it would be flat, which then would give us a new intersection point precisely where we were, right? Which gives us the big multiplier effect. So that was Keynes' theory, is that if wages are sticky, then we're going to get this big bang for our buck with different types of fiscal or monetary policy. All right, so Hayek and some other economists would disagree with Keynes and say that maybe we have something that looks like this. And if the supply curve is upward sloping like this, what happens to prices? What happens to prices when the government spends the money? What happens to prices? They go up, right? So now we're back to our chapter 10 story, is that we're going to have prices go up. What kind of prices, according to this model? Kind of that key point that I tried to hammer. What kind of prices? Resource prices are what? Constant. So the type of prices that are changing are, what do we call those? What type of prices are changing? The resource prices are constant, or are those changing? They're constant. So along this aggregate supply curve, maybe they're $10 or something. Nominal resource prices are $10 on average. So resource prices are constant. What sort of prices are going up? Just in general. I'm not trying to ask a fancy question. I just want to make sure we got this down. So capital would be a resource, so it's not that one. Goods and services, just final goods and services, right? Output prices, the prices of final output. So we use this output-input thing, right? So input prices remain fixed, output prices go up. This is the original story we said, is that as the economy evolves, it's likely that the prices on the shelves of the goods and services at Walmart are going to adjust first, and then maybe wages or resource prices will adjust second. If all of a sudden Walmart finds excess inventory, they run a sale. So output prices are pretty flexible, both in the upward direction and the downward direction, whereas it's possible wages are more sticky, right? So wages are more sticky, especially in the downward direction. Okay, so that brings us up to this point B. All right, where do we go from there? Where do we go from there? We start working our way back up what? Long run equilibrium, which is where's our eyeball attracted to when we're thinking long run? AD and LAS, right. I don't even have my graph mark, -1 for my picture here. So long run aggregate supply and aggregate demand is where the economy is headed towards, right? So if things are left to the free market system, the invisible hand, there's going to be resource price adjustment because people aren't able to put as much in their shopping cart as they did before, but they feel like they're working just as hard as they were. So there's going to start to be upward pressure on resource prices. Eventually, the economy would come back to a new long-run equilibrium point at point C. Well, that's the story we told before. What's going on upstairs then? If we look at the upstairs graph, what's happening with this? Here's the original story we told based on a certain number of assumptions. What really went on up here? It went down, that's right. So, and the thing we want to start to think about now, mechanically, it went down, but did it ever go up? Did it ever go up to here? Just want to challenge you on that. You're absolutely right, whoever said that. Who said that? Okay, so it would be located down, but did it ever go up in the first place? Well, if output prices remain the same, that's what would have caused it to go up to here. So if there's price movement, it never got up there in the first place, right? Meaning that the multiplier is bigger or smaller when we start to put in a price effect. It's smaller. So we got another thing that's chipping away at this idea of the multiplier. And so how we can show this with our graph is to say the price level was PL1 equal to 100. This graph has PL equal to 100. PL1. This picture with the green one also has that same price level stated. But our economic theory down here from aggregate demand and aggregate supply says that's not realistic unless prices were perfectly rigid, which even Keynes himself would probably disagree with. But if they were perfectly rigid, maybe in a very, very short run or something, I don't know. But that's one of the competing things. We never get up to there. And so our aggregate expenditure line, if we do come indeed to point B, you guys can trickle this back up to your 45-degree line, just to kind of cheat a little bit on the location of it, right? If the economy actually moves to point B, and we really never make it out to Y2, we really make it to, I'm just using numbers, so sorry about the chronology, we only go out to Y3, we only go out to this level of income, then the appropriate aggregate expenditure line is this one. And this one here is the aggregate expenditure at G2 and price level 2, which is this higher price level, PL2. Just the same story we talked about in chapter 10. So, what's the long run multiplier? What would you characterize the long run multiplier to be? It doesn't have really much math associated with it, so you math people that are burning up equations in your mind, you can chill out a little bit and use your graphing goggles to tell me what is the long run multiplier equal to. If the government says we're going to spend some money and do the $100 deal, What is the long run multiplier using your graphing goggles down here? How much does that $100 worth of spending by the government on the ditch help long run income? What is the long run multiplier? 1. So $100 leads to $100. So a 1-to-1, which now is starting to think, oh, maybe this isn't a good idea, right? Because I'm with you. Even at 1, it'd be like, I spent $100, but all I did was help GDP $100. That would be a 1 multiplier. So that the equation would look like this. The change in income that happened, is that multiplier 1 times the change in government spending? I spend $100, it leads to $100 worth of income. That's worth an extra credit point, Joe, but it's the wrong answer. What is the long run multiplier?
Well, potential GDP doesn't change in the long run. Does it multiply?
That's what we're thinking about. So what's the long run multiplier? 0. So Jeff's got one comment. 0. There is no multiplier. The multiplier is a fake fraud thing. There is no multiplier in the long run. Now, Keynes' rebuttal back to that is in the long run, we're all dead. So he didn't mind that. Because he said, hey, by the time we get to point Z, we're all dead anyway, so screw it, let's do something in the meantime. Maybe we can jack up the economy a little bit anyway, if we've got a couple things going on. So his response was, in the long run, we're all dead. So the long run multiplier, though, is 0. So what is the long run multiplier? Question mark. Good one for test or homework for sure. What is long run multiplier? The answer is 0. In other words, there is no multiplier. There is no multiplier effect. If there is something in the short run, the real question is, how long will it live? Because if the economy is going from A to B to C, as we talked about when we were in this chapter, the real path of the economy is probably having some resources starts to creep up. And so the actual path of adjustment along this, as both are simultaneously actually moving. Right? So for the model's purposes, we kind of talk, but in reality, those things will probably move together. And so economists like Hayek, that we watched on the video last time, would say prices move more fluidly than that. And so it won't be that long before we get here. And the digging a ditch to fill a hole thing might be more wasteful than what if we would not did that policy in the first place.
So you're just talking time-wise, and it would take the same amount of time to get from A to B as it would from B to C, right?
No, I'm trying to get away from that argument now. So if with the model, we can do anything we want. And we can say, let's hold this fixed, and then we'll move from A to B, and then we'll move this one, and we'll move from B to C. But if those two things are moving actually simultaneously, so if I had this is as good as it gets here for real-world animation, since I'm not a computer programmer to be able to do that. But imagine I'm going to try to keep my arm moving this way, and this one moving this way at the same time, and watch the intersection. Right? So the path of that leads to less of an effect on output is the main key takeaway. And indeed, given a long enough period of time, prices will fully adjust such that there is no multiplier. We get right back to potential.
So in other words, shocking the economy increases the price level, but real GDP remains the same.
That's right. Now, and the only way that we don't get that result is if the government has increased the resource base somehow. Because remember, our supply shifters, our long-run aggregate supply shifters, are quantities of resources and technology. So if somehow that money was spent towards technology or other things that help people be more productive, then maybe this actually moved a little to the left, which would have given us some sort of result. But then the economist in me thinks, where did that money come from? Did it get put into the right resources or technology? Or would a private business done just as well or better? Because now if we're taking money away from private business through taxation, and the government official sitting in the White House is thinking, I think it'd be a good idea to build some roads and bridges and internet service everywhere. Is that use of that money for sure getting us as big of a bang for buck as the entrepreneurs who, had that tax not been placed on them, would have reinvested into their own business and bought some new machines or new equipment or new technology? You follow what I mean? So there's no such thing as a free lunch. Everything has a cost. And so now we got to think about, well, what was the status quo? We can't immediately assume that the government's placement of those funds went into increasing the resource base. But furthermore, if they did do an increase that went in theory to the resource base, was it at the expense of that happening anyway in the private sector? Do we increase the kindergarten lunches and make all-day kindergarten? Is that the right place to put the next $1,000 worth of money? I don't know. That's a tough question. I mean, economists struggle to try to get that answer quantified somehow. Okay. Other questions or comments on that? So, once we get up to PL3, the last movement here is right back to where we started. So the final long-run aggregate, I don't know how you guys want to draw this or reference it, but the long-run AE is right back where we started. Meaning there is no multiplier. Okay. Questions? I am pleased to bring you round 2. The battle continues.
So I really feel like we just spent an hour learning nothing.
Yes, and the reason it's important, you bring up, I'm glad you said that, because I have a lot of my fellow economists that think this topic shouldn't even be taught. And a part of me wants to agree with that we just have this. But the reason why I choose to continue to do it and do a lot of work to show you how it all works is that there's still a lot of people that believe that this isn't the end conclusion, that it is impactful. And then it comes down to the question mark of the short run, long run, which is debatable too. So, but yes, I have some colleagues that would poo-poo even bringing this topic up. But I like to kind of and to me, these are the assumptions for you guys to make your own thing. This is what's assumed to get the outcome that that spending has an impact. And boy, I tell you, with this Cash for Clunkers program and some of the other things that both the Bush administration and Obama administration did, I don't think had bared much fruit for the economy. So I think we saw this come out in fairly short order. Far from in the long run we're all dead, we didn't see fruit from that particular program. And what did we get from Cash for Clunkers? Do you guys know what Cash for Clunkers are? It's been a little bit. Yeah, they took the old cars. So the government said, hey, you go buy a new car, I'll take your old one, whatever it is, and give you a fixed amount of money for it. Cash for Clunkers. And this was going to help stimulate that. One of the rules that the dealership had to do was destroy that car. So from an economist standpoint, we had a car that was functioning, right? It's just a used car. And they were giving, let's say, $4,500 or $5,000. I can't remember exactly what the amounts were. But you had maybe perhaps a good used car. And by law, what had to happen is the dealer took that in on trade and crushed it. Talk about a waste of resources. That, to me, is one of the greatest cases of all time of a government policy that had good intentions. I'm not saying they're bad guys, but they maybe didn't think about all of the economics behind it and how that would impact things over the long haul.
Would this be like factual if they were farming multiplier equals 0? Why does society allow stuff like that to happen?
Good question. All right, so there's some people that get helped. So the dealerships who got the dough, they thought, well, this is a good idea, right? So there's always ways to garner some support. And if the benefits are long enough away, for some people, they care less and less about it, right? So it's not as big of an issue for us normal people because, oh, that's the tax that my kids are going to pay. My son Carter's going to pay that one. I don't care, right? So I might tend to be a little more distant about caring about it.
And that eventually would help out like new car dealers because there's less used cars on them.
Yeah, and it also, another implication is that it hurt used car mechanics when you're taking off cars that are 10 to 15 years old and the people who buy and sell used parts. So those auto parts stores, they didn't like that policy. So there's always people who win and lose with the government meddling games. And it's really the government ultimately ends up playing favorites. Somebody gets, whenever we're redistributing something, and we're changing prices, somebody gets helped, and that's the easy one. As long as it's helping the right people, the politician might still get reelected, but somebody's got to pay for it too. And so there's always both sides of that. And that's why we continue to see programs like that feel good, but don't maybe have good implications. Minimum wage is another classic one. I mean, minimum wage got shot down big time prior to FDR. They would have never thought about that because if you analyze the economics of the minimum wage, it's almost, I mean, most economists agree, not all, by the way, because there's arguments maybe on the distributional effects and that, but most economists agree that that's a harmful policy. But it makes us feel good when we think, oh, we're helping the people who only make minimum, that's the least of the society, we're going to give them a bigger paycheck, maybe it'll be better for them ultimately. And so it's a feel-good policy. That happens a lot in politics. What's that, the minimum wage?
Yeah, because everybody pays right above it.
Yeah, it depends. Yeah, there's kind of a loaded thing to that we talked about, but you're right. It can take that effect. All right, other questions or comments while I'm getting round 2 loaded up here.
Like, you have to be a master to tell a story like that.
My movie's gonna kick that movie's mood.
We got to have this one loud. I want to rock. We're going to rock Ward Science.
Lord King, wow, it's such an honor.
Indeed, sir.
Please, just go right on through. Whoa. Identification, please. Hayek?
No, Hayek. Like, high explosives.
High explosives. We have a 1066 inches for every peak. We have a 1066.
Copy that, Mike. Goes to 1066. That was just an example of how to translate.
Okay. government spending on our economy. We're fortunate to have two world-renowned economists to offer their testimony on the matter.
I see you took a detour down the road to serfdom.
Talk about the end of laissez-faire.
Well, shake it off, Freddie. I'm not pulling any punches in there.
I'm ready. Are you?
Prepare for the return of the master.
John Maynard Keynes, F.A. Hayek, round 2. Round 2.0. Same economists, same beliefs, new microphones, new mustaches. Here we are, peace out, great recession thanks to me. As you see, we're not in a depression. Recovery, destiny, if you follow my lesson. More Keynes, here I come, line up for the procession.
We brought out the shovels and we're still in a ditch and still digging. Don't you think it's time for a switch from the hair of the dog? Friend, the party is over. The long run is here. It's time to get sober.
Are you kidding? Look, your work's perfectly fine. Have a look, the Great Recession ended back in 09. I deserve credit, things wouldn't have been worse. All the estimates prove it, I'll go chapter and verse.
Econometricians, they're ever so biased. Are they doing real science or confirming their bias? Their Keynesian models are tidy and neat, but that top-down approach is a fatal conceit.
Situation we choose. Oh, turn down the fight continues. Raising high, second round. It's time to win. Go from the top, go from the ground. Let's listen to the beats. Changing high, throwing down.
We could have done better had we only spent more. Too bad that only happens when there's a world war. You can carve all you want about stats and regression. Do you deny World War II cut short the depression?
Wow, one data point and you're jumping for joy. The last time I checked, wars only destroy. There was no multiplier. Consumption just shrank as we used scarce resources for every new tank. Pretty perverse to call that prosperity. Ration meat, ration butter, a life of austerity. When that war spending ended, your friends cried disaster. Yet the economy thrived and grew faster.
You do only see what you want to see. The spending on war clearly goosed GDP. Unemployment was over, almost down to zero. That's why I'm the master, that's why I'm the hero.
Creating employment's a straightforward craft. When the nation's at war and there's a draft, if every worker was staffed in the army and fleet, we'd have full employment and nothing to eat.
Situation we choose. Oh, turn down the fight continues. Changing high, second round. It's time to win. Go from the top, go from the ground. Let's listen to the beats. Changing high, throwing down.
Jobs are a means, not the ends in themselves. People work to live better, to put food on the shelves. Real growth means production of what people demand. That's entrepreneurship, not your central plan.
My solution is simple and easy to handle. It's spending that matters. Why is that such a scandal? Money sloshes through the pipes and the sluices, revitalizing the economy's juices. It's just like an engine that's stalled and gone dark. To bring it to life, we need a quick spark. Spending's the lifeblood that gets the flow going. Where it goes doesn't matter. Just get spending
You see
flowing.
slack in some sectors as a general rut, but some sectors are healthy, only some in a rut. So spending's not free, that's the heart of the matter. Too much is wasted as cronies get fatter. The economy's not a car, there's no engine to stall. No expert can fix it, there's no it at all. The economy's us, we don't need a mechanic. Put away the wrenches, the economy's organic.
Situation we choose. Oh, turn down the fight continues. Changing high, second round. It's time to win. Go from the top, go from the ground. Let's listen to the beats. Changing high, throwing
So
down.
what would you do to help those unemployed? This is the question you seem to avoid. When we're in a mess, when you have us just wait, doing nothing until markets equilibrate.
I don't want to do nothing, there's plenty to do. The question I ponder is who plans for whom? Do I plan for myself or leave it to you? I want plans by the many, not by the few. Let's not repeat what created our troubles. I want real growth, not a series of bubbles. Stop bailing out losers, let's prices work. If we don't try to steer them, they won't go
self-regulation. Even you must admit that the lesson we've learned is more oversight's needed, or else we'll get burned.
Oversight? The government's long been in bed with those Wall Street execs and the firms that they've led. Capitalism's about profit and loss. You bail at the losers, there's no end to the cost. The lesson I've learned is how little we know. The world is complex, not some circular flow. The economy's not a class you can master in college. To think otherwise is the pretense of knowledge.
And you're off to the races. I look at the world on a case-by-case basis. When people are suffering, I roll up my sleeves and do what I can to cure our disease. The future's uncertain, our outlooks are frail. That's why free markets are so prone to fail. In a volatile world, we need more discretion, so state intervention can counter depression.
People aren't chessmen you move on a board at your whim, their dreams and desires ignored. With political incentives, discretion's a joke. Those dials are twisting, just mirrors and smoke. We need stable rules and real market prices, so prosperity emerges and cuts short the crisis. Give us a chance so we can discover the most valuable ways to serve one another.
All right. So, what do you think? Comments? Questions? So the main chorus was kind of top down, bottom up. What was that all about? Top down, bottom up.
About how Keynesian theory wants more government intervention, help kind of regulate it.
Okay. So yes. And is that top down or bottom up? Top down, yeah. So with Keynes' theory, it's a little more of a top-down policy, right? So we're going to try to kind of support and orchestrate the economy with a top-down approach. So if we're thinking of the GDP, and we're thinking I can kind of support my level of income. If this is real GDP, am I better off having that level supported by good top-down economics, right? So we can kind of orchestrate through increasing spending at the right time, dropping taxes, increasing the money supply. So we're going to use all these tools that we're learning about in macro to kind of manage the economy. All right, so what's Hayek's bottom-up style? Okay, let prices play out. So by who?
Free market.
By the guys at the bottom. Who are the guys at the bottom? Are you at the bottom? You at the bottom? You at the bottom? You at the bottom? I'm at the bottom, right? It's us letting all the agents of the economy, the households and the firms, figure out what's best for themselves. And so the bottom-up philosophy, this is really kind of a general philosophy about how we think the country should be ran. Because these guys are sophisticated and they've analyzed it and they've got PhDs, then they know better how to set up the game in such a way that we maximize this distance. Whereas other people might say the bottom-up approach would be much, much better. All right, so I got some hands.
So is it similar like to the political stuff, like Democrats and Republicans? Democrats like more government information generally.
Yeah, to be general about it, in general, currently, Democrats would probably have a little more government intervention than Republicans, but not a lot more. So one of the rubs with conservatives, and I guess where the Republicans have taken things the last 20 to 30 years, they're kind of big government too. And so they might claim to be more limited government, but more like the Tea Party movement is a little more of limited government. There's a party called the Libertarian Party, which sounds kind of liberal, but it's actually just the opposite. It's more about limited government and restricting the roles that the government plays. So Republicans tend to get into bed with big corporations and big, kind of like what those scenes were showing. Democrats the same way. So I don't have a strong feeling of making that the opposing view. I think Hayek's thing is a little different and could be more likely to be played in conservative circles because the idea of limited government. I don't like to take, I'm not a Democrat or Republican, by the way. I would say I'm pretty conservative, and so I've tended to vote Republican, but not always in my life too. So I don't like politics that much because I like the real underlying things that are going on. As an economist, I want to think about how things can go, and so the bottom-up approach does have some need for a government. So it's certainly by no stretch, it's not a no government approach. So what are some important ingredients for the bottom-up approach? Or if you got other comments to say, I didn't mean to pose it that way. We can come back to that too. But Todd? Production. We got production by big companies, small companies. The government produces something. So, I mean, production's certainly an important element, but I don't think helps necessarily distinguish the difference between these two, but certainly needed. Jeff?
Well, the bottom up would remove things like, the bailouts and the tax incentives, and
right?
Those things that push into the economy.
Yep, all the subsidies to ethanol as being the new green energy. The bottom up approach would say, let the market figure it out. If that's worthwhile, the prices of goods will attract people to those sectors. Maybe we'll develop some new form of clean energy because it's cheaper than using coal or whatever. But the approach would be to not let the environmentalists, the scientists, and the uppity-ups figure out what's best for us, but let that invisible hand figure out. Now, does that have its problems? Sure it does, right? But it's kind of, sometimes we get to a point where what if we created that so much government spending of my hard-earned tax dollars are going towards this particular pet project or this particular pet project or this one. And it seems like it starts to become who knows who is more important than who knows what. And that's where I think it starts to get a little dangerous. All of a sudden we're like, well, maybe that it would be better if we had 100 companies trying to figure out what the best thing was of where we put those dollars. rather than somebody steering dollars into ethanol production, one particular form of production at a particular point in time. Okay, did I see another hand?
I think you just have to use it.
Okay. So bottom up, what do we need from government, though, to have a successful bottom-up approach? I think you're right on trying to minimize government involvement in particular industries, but what do some of these entrepreneurs need?
Need laws, like property laws.
Yeah, the property rights. So we've mentioned this before, but when we have those basic property rights, that they're well enforced, they're well monitored, we have a good solid court system. Entrepreneurs know that if they're taking the risk with their money, that if they make it, this will be the consequence. If they don't make it, this will be the consequence, right? So we have a good structured rule of law. And what the bottom-up people would argue is that ultimately, with that approach, maybe we can have this be bigger than what a top-down approach could be. And we don't know. It's not like this one can't work at all, but we have a choice between this, and can we look at the underlying economics of the two choices and come to some rational conclusions of which one would be a better approach. Okay, other comments? All right, so bottom up would be Hayek, just to kind of fill some of this in. The Keynes be a little more top-down approach. Hayek came with, and it was mentioned in one of the two videos or both, but he wrote something called the fatal conceit. And it was his criticism of the top-down approach that in some ways it's arrogance to think that you can have a bigger impact than what you can, right? And he went so far to say the fatal conceit that it can ultimately lead to a bad situation over the long run, that it's going to kill us if we continued on that path. So it was also mentioned in the video, The Road to Serfdom, which I actually just purchased that book here recently, but I haven't read it all the way through, but I've heard bits and pieces. I got the general gist of it. But The Road to Serfdom was this long-term prediction of Hayek that if we continued this way, eventually the economy could grow into a beast where the government and big business kind of control most of the economy. And the serfs, anybody had a little history with the serfs, who the serfs were? The servants. Yeah, so the serfs were kind of the peasants. And so he claimed that if we continue this line of thinking, we're on the road to serfdom, that we'll have the economy controlled by a few powerful few in the government and big business, and the rest of us would be left hanging. And so it was this fatal conceit that he said that there's some people, by the way, well-intentioned people, perhaps up here, not bringing up that they're evil and that they're trying to control the universe like the cartoons have it, that we've seen in the Lego movie and that sort of thing, like Dr. Evil's up here at the top. These are well-intentioned people that believe that this is a better approach. And there's other arguments that say maybe having an invisible hand guide us is a better option if that grows into the buddy system, which is what economists call cronyism. I don't think we've really mentioned that word yet in this class too much. But this fatal conceit, I'm going to write it up here, but cronyism is kind of the good old boys network where it's the big boss and he's got the senator and his, all these movies that you see where the senator's in the back pocket and they're greasing some money under the table. So who your cronies are, your old friends, kind of big government and big business getting into bed with each other. It's probably the short way of saying that, and that's cronyism. the libertarian groups and other free market type minded groups, the Tea Party type groups, that's probably their biggest concern. That doesn't lead to a good outcome when we concentrate money and power with the few, and then it's just a phone call away for you to get that next subsidy from your golf buddy that you're going to see this Saturday on how many $100 million worth of tax dollars are going to be channeled to that particular activity that favors you both. And then, of course, he'll slip a nice little $1 million donation into the senator's next political campaign. Right? You just start to get this whole network of stuff that we see that's out there, and this is a different approach to say we don't have to go that way. And it also says something about, is the answer to this problem more government, more regulation? No, because they're the ones making the rules. That's part of the whole problem in the first place. And that's, as young folks you guys are, you tend to maybe grow up with that perception that the government has the answers. We can always fall back on the government needs to fix that was a market problem. As you start to dig into the details, it may have turned out that big government was the problem, that market failure is one thing, but to have government failure that's bigger than the market failure isn't necessarily a good answer, right? So there's also such a thing as government failure, the government failing to make the situation better. Okay. Other questions or comments? What else do we have in that video? If we run out of gas, I can move on to the next topic, but I'd love to just talk the rest of the way out about this a little longer. Okay.
The top down, is that like the trickle down effect I've heard of?
Good question. It's a little bit different, I'd say. So, and maybe even a lot different. So that's a great question. Let me think about how I want to answer that. In general, the trickle-down theory came about from quite a big burden. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into chapter 13 of the tax rates on the rich. So the old Robin Hood theory of take from the rich and give to the poor, at one point in the United States history led to 70% tax. Every $100 that you own, the government got 70, you got to keep 30. Let me restate that. I know you guys are like, in America? Yes, in America. Prior to, in the 1970s, we had high marginal tax rates that were in the 70% range. So getting back to the, let me finish the trickle-down thing and I'll come back to you. So the idea there is that if I lower those tax rates for the rich, perhaps, that'll give them more money, and that's bad, but the trickle-down theory would say that's going to incentivize them to reinvest that money into business and maybe to do some new ventures, because the people who we're taxing at those high rates might be the movers and shakers in the economy. And if that's true, then freeing up some of that money will then create new jobs, new industry, new innovation, and ultimately paychecks that will trickle down to the lower income levels. So that's kind of the trickle down, which of course is right in line perhaps with Hayek's bottom-up approach, right? If we're lowering the tax rates in hopes of that creating growth, putting it back into private sector hands, into small business, that's actually a Hayek approach. So that part of the trickle-down story would be very much in line with the bottom-up approach, actually, rather than the top-down. So the top-down approach is more of the more government, more spending to be able to control some of the resources in the economy, more control of resources, which happens through increases in taxes.
So they're taxing the poor, or they're taxing more at the higher rates.
Right.
Giving relief to
Yep. Yeah, Todd.
It's kind of like communist policy, where it's like a safety net.
Yeah, I mean, so Todd's question was, is that kind of like communist theory? And truly, that's the ultimate of top-down theory, right? So when we mentioned communism before, the government, or very few, owns everything, right? And we all kind of share everything. We'll figure out the best way to do it. So from a centrally planned economy, that's kind of the ultimate of that. Of course, we didn't have too good experiences with Stalin and Hitler. That approach didn't work out so well. Chavez, there's a number of leaders, Castro. So that is kind of the ultimate top-down approach. What we're talking about in the United States, I don't think most people would argue we'd get to there, but what Hayek's Road to Serfdom speaks to is that it could get to a point where it's still most of the control is concentrated with a few at the top.
You said Hitler. Did he turn around the entire economy?
Yeah, Hitler did have some impacts. I don't remember what GDP was, but yeah, it did do some good, if you will, in the form of real GDP, which that's why we can't always rely on real GDP as the only measure of social welfare, because he did lots of truly evil, bad things. So
I was just in like a perfect world, you would want a little mix of both. That's about like the video.
Okay, so that's a good question. Do we want a mix of both? The answer is absolutely. The mix is needed for certain things. The laws, the rule of the land, stable monetary policy. Hayek wouldn't have any problem with there being a central bank, but he'd probably, well, he might. There's other alternatives to that. That's more than I want to get into. But Friedman's policy of a fixed policy for the money, that would be more of what Hayek would probably agree with. So that we're not tinkering with the amount of money supply to try to influence real GDP. It's just fixed at 3%. So yes, we'd still have the government issuing the currency, doing all the mechanics of clearing checks and making sure the banking system is regulated and monitored. The laws are very solid. The government's needed for all those sorts of things. But it's this active pulling the strings of the puppeteer stuff is that we want to get away from. And every time we have an opportunity to think about whether control could be shifted into the private sector away from the government on choices, we tend to shift it down. So that's the bottom-up idea, is to keep the power and control in the individual citizens. Every single individual, right down to the individual person, is kind of the ultimate in individual freedom, something that our Constitution supported too. The founders of the country were pretty sure that this was not a good idea from their 2,000 years of history, looking back at how the monarchies and other things worked. That didn't work out so hot. Okay, so what are we doing on time? Looks like we're about done. See ya on Wednesday.